So this talk is primarily about introducing Vue to a new audience. So what I want to do is make people understand its position between React and Angular. There's also a point of talking about its scalability, where you could use it in very simple, almost jQuery situations, all the way up to these large spas that a lot of enterprises are doing. And that's one of the reasons I like teaching it, is it doesn't need doesn't need 14 things to be built in order to run a hello world. It can be used in a very small, compact way if that's what your real needs are. Developers primarily, like web developers of all stripes. People that are new to web development will understand how Vue would come into a simple project, and people that are long-term web developers, if they haven't already done Vue, this will be a good opportunity to understand how it's positioned differently than some of the other frameworks, and how it doesn't really compete with the other two big frameworks, in that it does things fairly differently than they do. My goal is never to is not to bash any technology one way or another, because I'm at my heart, I feel like I'm a pragmatist, and the tool you're using is often the right tool for the job. And the idea that we, take it out because we didn't like one or two things about any framework, we'd get rid of every framework. It's sort of like, I'm having problems working on my Japanese car. I'm just going to replace all the nuts with non-metric, with imperial standards, because I don't have, my big set of wrenches are all imperial, they're not metric. It just doesn't make any sense to try to do that. And that's what I think we do with frameworks a lot, is that I have a blog post from, I think, a couple of years ago now, called stay on your horse and ride it, with the idea that stop trying to find the perfect framework because it doesn't exist. Work on what you know until you know it well enough so that you know all the problems with it and can work around those problems. But every time you hit a problem, if you think the new framework that comes out is going to solve it, you just haven't found its flaws, because everything's. I do training, mostly online training through PLURASIGHT. So I do some face-to-face training every year, as well as I have my own little video training business that I sell courses through. So it's almost entirely training. Most of the programming I do is for nonprofits, like the Atlanta Code Camp and some other local organizations around, to try to keep my hand in actual projects so that my training is better. Mostly ASP.NET. I have an end-to-end course where I show Angular, Bootstrap, ASP.NET, and writing APIs from file new all the way to deployment. And then I have other courses that sort of fill in those same sort of topics. I have a lot on building APIs in .NET Core, as well as .NET Framework, how to design .NET how to design APIs, not .NET APIs, but just how to design APIs on their own. And I have some older courses for things like using Visual Studio Code versus using Visual Studio, but mostly in the Microsoft space. That's an interesting question. I think they didn't have a singular vision is the real problem, because they were chasing Apple and Android, and they never caught up. Right. I like the devices. I used them for a long time. But once I got back to Android, the experience was just better. I wish Android had picked up a few of the new ideas that came out of Windows Phone, but without the developers on the platform, it was doomed, right? The minute you couldn't get the latest, I mean, Android and Apple have had this sort of fight between them, and Apple usually wins in being the first platform for a lot of games or a lot of apps. And that's always been sort of stressor. And then you throw a third party that has 4% of the market, they're going to be not only third, they're going to be a far third for any of these sort of new and trendy apps coming to it. I don't think their problem was hardware. I don't think they should have bought Nokia. I think that was sort of an attempt to go, okay, maybe if we just get into the hardware business, we can achieve that. But, you know, hindsight's 2020. I like the programming model, but I had kind of come to the phone from the sort of Silverlight world, which I accidentally fell into. And so it was a natural programming model for me. Since then, I've been doing almost exclusively web, and I'm a lot happier in that space than I was in the phone world, where there wasn't an audience, and then before that in the Silverlight world, because I felt like we were closing ourselves down to some things that were happening on the web, and Silverlight died the day that Jobs said there would never be plugins on the iPhone. It wasn't for any other technical reason. That was the day that they should have shut it all down.
I can remember being in a taxi driving to the airport, and the taxi driver was telling us about how he had a side job selling a Flash application, and so he'd been going and standing outside the Apple store trying to stop people from buying Apple phones because it was impacting his job. Which,
yeah.
I just sort of smiled and I thought, I'm not saying anything. I'm not going to get in an argument, but I don't think you're going to win that one. So
No. Originally, it was just going to be sort of this love letter to software development, because I grew up in a pretty rough growing up with a single family home and mental illness in my family, and we were really poor. And so when I became a software developer, I've always felt really lucky that I sort of fell into it. I dropped out of high school and college, and luckily made my way to writing software in my teens and 20s, and that sort of saved my life. And so that was going to be what I was going to tell the documentary about. And then as I was doing it, I realized that I'd heard this statistic about how many women developers there were. And what bothered me wasn't that I'd never worked with a woman developer before, at least not a North American woman developer, but that I'd never noticed. Like, I just never noticed that people of color and women were missing. And so that's what the movie's really about, is sort of my journey through that as someone who looks like the stereotype of what software developers are. I feel like if I can open my eyes, maybe I can open some other people's eyes about it. So the movie talks about the history of women in software development and the lack of people of color, especially Black African Americans, in some ways that maybe we can slowly make it better.